Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to this third infrastructure intelligence coming out of COVID webinar. It's the third in our summer series, and today we're looking at the issue of the resilience of both our industry and infrastructure in general, guarding against the next time, making the industry resilient. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with our, well, I have to say, is a tip-top panel of speakers drawn from different aspects of the industry. How can we make the industry and infrastructure more resilient against future crisis? What lessons can we learn from the current crisis? How can we actually make sure that the industry is prepared for the future? I think we'll be looking at how organisation and infrastructure itself can be more resilient, and any improvements that we can make to current practices. Our speakers today will obviously look at resilience through their own organisation's experience and how they've fared over recent months, but obviously looking at the broader issues facing the industry, and I think it's fair to say business itself. Just a bit of a housekeeping announcement, first of all. Obviously, back in the day, we'd be talking about where the toilets are. That's not needed today for obvious reasons. If you do have any questions for any of the speakers or the whole of the panel, then please post those questions in the questions box that we have in the app or in the web dashboard that will be on your screen at the moment. If you can, and if you want, when posting a question, if you actually put your company name as well as your name in it. I mean, I'll get your name anyway, but if you put your company name, I'm happy to say, you know, we have a question from, you know, Joe Bloggs from Tate and Lyle or whatever it might be. Don't know why I thought about Tate and Lyle, probably because I'm hungry. But anyway, please do that, and we'll obviously, you know, reference you. You don't have to, and we won't do that if if you just, put your name, but you just put your questions in there, and we will draw from those questions in the discussion. So kicking things off, our first panelist is Chris Young, who is Executive Managing Director of Tony Gee, the consultancy firm Tony Gee. He's chairman of their executive board, and he has responsibility, as you would expect in that position, for the strategic development and growth of the business. Chris has got wide experience as a project manager on a number of different projects throughout the industry sector, and I'm sure he will have some interesting insights on this whole question of industry resilience. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, for that introduction. So yeah, I've been asked to give my thoughts on this, and there's really sort of two questions that have been asked here. One is about organisational resilience, and one is about more general infrastructure resilience. So I'm going to start with organisational resilience, I think, just because it's sort of from our perspective, really. And it was quite interesting, actually. I did a little bit of reading around having been asked this question, and came across a really useful and interesting report, actually, which I kind of had skim read a few years ago, but not really looked into it, called Are We Built on a House of Cards? And this was written back in 2018, which was around the time, it was actually researched in 2017 and written in sort of latter part of beginning of 18. So it was around about the time of Carillion collapse. So it doesn't actually look at pandemics and things like that, but it looks at resilience of the industry in general. And much of what it says in there actually is still valid today. One of the things that struck me about this, though, actually, was that, and a few stats and numbers here, 76% of those organisations questioned said that organisational resilience was a key to their long-term future and strategy, but 63% said there's a lack of understanding of the subject. So it's very clear that resilience is uppermost in people's minds about how they need to run their businesses, but there's also a definite lack of understanding as to what it actually meant and how they would go about it. So most people seem to have an appreciation that resilience is a long-term issue, and it's not just about mitigating short-term risks or events, and that's fairly clear. But it's noted that resilience is also about taking advantage of opportunities. So it's not just about mitigating disasters and being able to deal with things that go wrong. It's also about having the resilience and the sort of agility to take advantage when opportunities come along. So there's a bit of a fine distinction there on resilience. And the point about providing and developing a resilient business is it takes a lot of time and effort to do that. And there's a long-term, a long-term financial investment in these things, and not just short-term investment. So you've got to talk about things like business systems, IT, training, developing protocols, and developing people. And there's also a long-term kind of emotional and leadership investment in this. So you can invest and you can develop the systems that work, but if the people and the culture of a business don't go along with those systems and those ideas, actually all you're doing really is throwing money at the problem and not solving it. So that in long-term sort of kind of emotional long-term leadership investment is just as important, I think, as some of the more practical things that we all think about when we talk about resilience of staff and everything else like that. The other thing that came out after this, my sort of research and the study and this report actually as well, is that short-term goals, especially financial, can often restrict organisations' ability to invest in the long term. So there's always a dilemma between trying to provide a return on your investment, a sort of short-term stable position, and looking at what you need to do for the long 10, 15-year plan. And that's a dilemma that everybody has to deal with. But I think, in my opinion, actually, and this is one of the sort of the principles that we've been trying to deal with at Tony G, is that you've got to look at that longer term picture to provide the long term resilience in your business. Short term things will never work. It's just false economy. The problem with that is that most of us work on a fairly short term cycle. So a lot of us look at things like, what's our order book for the next 12 months? We report accounting on an annual basis. So you have to really kind of take your time and step outside and look at what those longer long-term resilient things need to be. And so, you know, do we actually invest and look at those in enough detail? The answer is probably yes and no to some degree. So looking a bit more specifically about now, a few of the things that we've done actually in the short term and what we're doing to come out of this is obviously when this became apparent that this was going to be a worldwide pandemic and it was going to affect us all, there was always a bit of a sort of head in the sand for quite a long time with a lot of people actually, where we just think, oh, it's a problem in China and it'll never come to us. But once it eventually became obvious that it was going to affect us, I think there was a temptation to make short-term decisions about training, staff, recruitment, investment in apprentices and students, all of those things. And you know, I'd be dishonest to say that we didn't have those same discussions. You know, we looked at those and thought, God, what do we need to do? It's going to be really critical. And we made a few short-term decisions that we had to make at that time, but they weren't particularly radical. But everything we were doing, we were trying to keep one eye on that long-term investment picture for the future resilience of the business. So we've continued to invest in our, you know, we're still taking our same quota of sponsored students and apprentices for this year, and we're looking at that picture in 10, 15 years' time, because this is a short-term crisis that we have to weather. But to keep a long-term sustainable business, you have to look at the resilience in that way. So that's what we've kind of done there. The other things obviously that we've been looking at is things like investment in IT. And actually, you know, we, like I suspect a number of our competitors, have actually accelerated our spend on IT. You know, we were planning certain things anyway, and actually we've used this opportunity to bring those forward to give us more flexibility and more resilience of the way we work in the future. And hand in hand with that is looking at how we use our offices and whether we will expand our offices in the next few years. You know, we have a plan of when our offices are likely to be full up based on our sort of current growth plan. And I suspect those plans will go back by a couple of years, maybe longer, where we'll actually be using more working from home and being able to flex the office space a bit better. And those office spaces will probably change as well. You know, we're talking much more about the model of using office spaces as collaboration centres. So people come into the offices to talk and discuss things, and then probably for part of their time will disappear back into other locations to actually do some of that work. So from an organisational point of view, you know, we have increased our resilience by making ourselves more flexible and making them more adaptable to these future shocks that will happen. So very quickly, I don't want to take too much time, but onto the point about infrastructure resilience, about how the industry can do better. I think actually when you look at these two problems, the solutions and the problems are actually very similar with organisational resilience and infrastructure and industry resilience. The macro challenges of improving our infrastructure are very similar to the micro changes that we face on a business basis. So again, looking forward at long-term investment plans and trying to look at not doing short-term things that will have a long-term effect, you know, further on down the line. So you're looking at long-term resilience and not the short-term sticking plasters. And I think one of the things that's probably going to come out of all of this is that there'll be a lot more holistic system-wide planning of infrastructure development, where the drift from designing and building projects will become a thing of the past, and actually we'll be designing systems and integrated systems where one has an effect on the other. the very simplistic example is, why would you build a Parkway railway station on the edge of the city if you haven't got decent links from that station into the middle of the city? It's a simplistic example, but that's the kind of thing that it needs to be considered much more to keep up that resilience. And similarly with things like bringing in the other long-term goals that we have on environmental concerns, carbon reduction and so forth. There's no point in developing infrastructure plans if you then screw up the planet by building too much carbon into those systems. So there's a lot more holistic approach to all of these things. And I think my final point actually is that and I've sort of said it a few times here, is that the long-term planning and investment is what we have to do. If we don't do those things, we just end up continually locked into this sort of firefighting battle of disaster after disaster, without having a decent plan to continue us through and be able to adapt when these situations occur. That's all I need to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that. I think a nice quote there: long-term resilience, not short-term sticking plasters. And I think we will have some conversation around that and some of the other things that you just said in that introduction. Our next speaker is Juliet Meehan, and Juliet Meehan, and Juliet is Technical Director of the Resilience Shift. And for those that don't know or aren't aware of the Resilience Shift's work, the Resilience Shift is an organisation, an initiative that exists to inspire and empower a global community to make the world safer through resilient infrastructure. As we all know, when infrastructure fails, the consequences can be catastrophic. And clearly the recent period, although it isn't the only crisis that infrastructure has faced, has been particularly challenging for the world's infrastructure. As I said, Juliet is a Technical Director of a Resilience Shift, an experienced civil engineer of over 20 years experience, and she's worked on infrastructure projects both in the UK and overseas. So I think it's fair to say that Juliet has an in-depth understanding of this whole topic of infrastructure resilience. So no pressure there, Juliet.
No pressure.
Over to you.
Thanks, Andy. And I think there is a bit of pressure in times like this when you've been specialising in resilience for a number of years for everyone to say, well, come on, Juliet, what are the answers? I'm not sure that I know. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. And I think just one more piece of background about the Resilience Shift. It's a not-for-profit initiative, and it's hosted by Arup. So I actually work in Arup, so I also have that sort of context of large global engineering organisations going through this crisis, and funded by the Lloyd's Register Foundation, which is part of the sort of charitable foundation above the Lloyd's Register group. So I think, picking up on the question, I think one of the things I did want to reflect on is I actually think as an industry and our infrastructure systems in the UK have done incredibly well in this crisis. And, it is unprecedented in terms of scale. I think just from my own point of view, the fact that our power, our water, our transport, distribution of food, our information infrastructure, which has proved to be absolutely critical and essential, has done really well. And I think, that's a positive. And, my own sort of personal thanks for everyone who's been working so hard in doing that. But I think also, well, we're not through the crisis, and we certainly shouldn't be complacent. And there's something very important about resilience that really we're never done. It's a learning, adapting, reflecting process. So we need to always reflect on that. Never think that because something has gone well that we can relax and be complacent. So I wanted to use the slots that I have to just go slightly wider. Think of, as we've been saying, some of the lessons that we're all learning from the current situation. I think it's very sort of fair to say, and certainly by this webinar and others, that the use of the term resilience has certainly gone through the roof in recent weeks and months. So, working for an organisation called the Resilience Shift, there's a thank you for that one, for COVID, if nothing else. The way we quite often in our Open and Resilience Shift frame our discussions about resilience, and I think we're all at risk of getting caught up in jargon or having others thinking that we're just slipping into jargon, but the sort of questions that we run through are, what are we talking about? Resilience of what? Resilience to what? And resilience for whom? And to frame the question in that way. So I thought I'd go through those. So starting with resilience of what? And as the title of this webinar is about the resilience of the industry, and yes, for all of us, that is fundamentally important. We want our industry to be resilient. We want to continue to sort of thrive and survive as people working in the infrastructure sector. And there are lessons that as an industry we need to learn, changes that we need to make in how we prepare, respond, recover, and really importantly to transform, as Chris was saying, sort of take the opportunity that we currently have to do things differently. But also, again, reflecting on what Chris was saying, the industry is here because we are planning, procuring, designing, delivering, operating infrastructure, and it is ultimately those infrastructure systems that in the long term need to be resilient. And then to go one step above that, it's the societies and communities and the people who are relying on our infrastructure that really need to be resilient. And I think something really important in terms of the lessons from COVID. Previously, a lot of discussions of resilience focused on a particular shock event, a hurricane, an extreme weather event, a terror attack, how things recovered from that. What we've learned in COVID is we've taken out the physical aspect, and we can see that it is all about the people. There is no physical impact on any of our infrastructure systems, but the way that they are and need to be resilient is about the people who use them, the people who operate them, and the leadership and the decisions that people are making. So then moving on to resilience to what? And I'm sure it's stating the obvious, but for this whole panel, for the discussion, it is really important. And there are, I would say a sort of worrying amount of discussions about resilience to pandemics. And that's not what we need. We need to come out of this learning about pandemics, being resilient to the next thing that's going to surprise us. And one of the important sort of lessons or things that's reinforced by all of this is the future was always uncertain. And from where we're sitting now, I think the future is even more uncertain for our world, for our infrastructure sectors. So the only thing we can really be certain about is that uncertainty. So we shouldn't be focusing on pandemic. We should be focusing on what we've learned about dealing with surprises. I think, again, for our organisations and for our infrastructure, it's not actual pandemic. There have been people falling sick, and that has had a direct implication. But really, the impacts on what we're doing are, because of the lockdown, massive changes in demand across all the infrastructure sectors, rapidly moving to new ways of working, now looking out towards what the long-term economic impact is, coping with supply chain disruption. None of those are specifically pandemic, but it's just indicative of the sort of range of shocks and stresses that we need to be dealing with. So it's the importance of sort of reflecting, learning from the pandemic, and seeing what we need to be better at in the future in a bigger picture. Some of the common themes from our work at Resilience Shift and talking about resilience that have been emphasised by the current situation, we talk about fragmented governance and fragmented decision making, and working in silos are all barriers to being resilient, and that's certainly the case now. The importance, again, Chris has already picked up on this, on whole systems thinking and whole system approaches, and all of us working across all the sectors having a common understanding, common aim to what matters. And I think the final thing, really importantly to reflect on is, if we as an industry, as a country, weren't prepared for pandemic, we're certainly not prepared for climate change. And that's bigger, it's slower, it's not transient. The global implications of that are huge, and we need to keep that sort of front and centre of our minds. And then the final part of the framing is about the resilience for whom. Why do we need to be resilient? And that again comes back to the issues of people and communities. We need infrastructure, the role of infrastructure in supporting communities, reducing inequalities, all of that's absolutely key. And there are, society around the world relies on infrastructure to continue to function as it has done now, so that they can themselves continue to function, particularly in our increasingly sort of urbanized, city-focused world. So it's remembering that our infrastructure is there for people who rely on it. It has a function which is typically protecting people, connecting people, providing essential services. So it's all about the continuity of that function rather than of any one individual infrastructure asset. And I think this crisis, as all crises, it's probably fair to say, has highlighted inequalities in communities in society, and we need to all remember that infrastructure is really important in dealing with that. So I think just the closing comments sort of wrap up that all up. I think increasingly what we're talking about, learning about is leadership and leadership decisions. As Resilience Shift, I think, as I said at the beginning, we're an organisation with resilience in its name. We were like, we need to do something in response to COVID, but we also didn't want to necessarily contribute to the noise and the number of people saying, here's how we can help. But we instigated a project which has proved absolutely fascinating about resilient leadership, where we've been interviewing week by week senior executives from the private sector and city resilience officers from around the world. So they're all in different situations, they're all seeing things unfold. I think there's all sorts of, the more we get to look into that, we'll learn more. One of the absolutely key messages that there's no silver bullet. We're not looking at one organisation saying if everybody does it like this, we'll be fine, because everybody has their own issues to deal with. But collaboration is key. I think another important theme that's coming out of this leadership is transformation. So not just to recover from this crisis and get back to where we were, but to take the opportunity to come out of this crisis and take ourselves to a better future, bringing up the issues of decarbonisation. There's something that I think is interesting to discuss, is at the moment, I'm seeing that there's, at least in the short term, there's going to be tension between coming out of COVID safely, making everyone, our colleagues, our communities feel that they can travel around safely, and the longer term issues of decarbonisation, moving towards more public transport, all of those issues. So, it's a challenge, but that's okay. We like challenges in our working in the infrastructure sector. So how do we come out safely from the pandemic, but also working towards the longer term, sustainable, resilient future? I think collaboration is key to that. And again, COVID has hit everyone globally, and we're really seeing that play out globally. And climate change, again, is a truly global challenge that we're all going to need to collaborate together. None of us, just as with COVID, no organisation or country is going to come out of this on their own if everyone else that we interact with doesn't also come out safely. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Juliet. I mean, I think, looking at the wider issue there of resilience, what actually is resilience? It's clearly not just coming through the current crisis unscathed or being able to respond to it, but it's more about responding for the long term, coming out stronger, both in terms of firms, organisations, and obviously infrastructure itself. Speaking of infrastructure itself, we saw the figures this morning, for the economy, and there were particular sectors that were quite hard hit, and we can all name them. Obviously, construction and infrastructure is one of them, but within that, obviously, industries like hospitality, which obviously isn't working at the moment effectively, and also the airline industry is obviously facing specific challenges at the moment. And how does that remain resilient in current times? And we're really delighted that Phil Wilbraham has joined us this morning, who's the Expansion Programme Director at Heathrow. That's a role he's had since 2017, and he is responsible, obviously not on his own, but for delivering Heathrow's third runway, along with all the infrastructure to support it. And Phil, previously as Development Director, has been responsible for all the capital works at Heathrow, and I'm sure that he will give a very valuable insight into this whole question of infrastructure at the present time. So, Phil, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Andy, and it's great to be taking part in this really important discussion and totally relevant discussion at the moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about Heathrow and then a bit about and a bit about infrastructure in general and where that might go, and then a little bit about the construction industry. So Heathrow is caught a bit in the eye of the storm, as in fact Andy was saying, and we at the moment are serving only about 3 or 4% of the normal number of passengers that we serve at Heathrow. So the short-term work there is to ensure that we basically reduce the size of our infrastructure, and we've done that by, we're now working off 1 runway rather than 2 at Heathrow, so we're only using 1 runway, and we're only using 2 of our 4 terminals. So we are able to some extent to reduce our costs by reducing the amount of infrastructure we're using, and therefore reducing the number of people who are actually serving passengers, etc. So that's very short term. Well, where we want to go is we want to obviously build back better, and we will, as passengers come back, we will naturally, open up Heathrow again. And what will be interesting to see, and we really don't know yet how quickly the passengers will come back, how quickly, in fact, demand will come back to Heathrow and other airports, and for the airlines as well. And it's difficult to say whether that's going to be, this summer, this autumn, or over the next 2 or 3 years. But it is clear that people will still want to travel. Whether they'll travel for the same reasons is going to be interesting as well. Whether people will actually do less traveling for business, for instance, because they can do things like we're doing today, and therefore people will travel for different reasons. But so the airport will be watching that, will adapt, will change, and it is really important that we work, our infrastructure hard, and we will be looking at how different processes in the airport will be needed. As you'll read in the press, we're now checking people's temperatures and all those things, and actually security may change, and there'll be social distancing, people wearing masks. All these things are happening at airports, and we will adapt and change, and we're looking forward then to demand coming back. As far as expansion is concerned, just so you're aware, long term, Heathrow still believes that a 3rd runway will be needed, and therefore we are busy at the moment actually appealing to the Supreme Court following the judgment at the appeal court on the 27th of February. So that process is ongoing. It is to some extent paused, but there is work going on. But it's, as a long-term plan, Heathrow still expects to expand to a 3rd runway. And if you look at this more broadly, the Infrastructure Client Group, which I'm a member of, has been working with the Institution of Civil Engineers and launched an green paper, which is really trying to look at how infrastructure will be used in the future. And so this was launched in May. And what we're looking at there, what we did some research into what people think will be needed in the future, whether that's about, whether we'll do more of this sort of thing, or whether we will actually go back to our offices, whether we'll use public transport, all these questions, some of which have been raised already. So what are the public perceptions around that? We're looking at that, and we're actually out of consultation to get some more information on that. And again, has been just what are we actually learning from this pandemic, from COVID-19, and therefore will that change how we want to communicate, connect with each other? Will we still be global? All these questions are out there in this green paper that's been put together, and therefore then what lessons do we need to learn about our infrastructure as we go about determining what infrastructure we need in the future? So this is a really important piece, because it's one can look at actually how we do this, but the most important thing to discuss first, I think, is what infrastructure will we need in the future? Can we plan for that? Are we planning the right infrastructure at the moment, and what changes should we make? Because there is no doubt that we will need to change, we'll need to build more infrastructure, we'll need to actually change the infrastructure that we've got as well. So I would urge you to look at the Infrastructure Civil Engineers website and read that green paper, and also provide your consultation feedback for the Infrastructure Client Group, which then goes on to what the industry is doing. And the Construction Leadership Council have brought the industry, or the construction industry, well together, I think. And they've been looking, as people will be aware, at 3 stages: restart, reset and reinvent. So we're in the restart stage at the moment, where construction sites are back, generally up and running in this country, not quite so fast in Scotland, but most sites are back working in the UK. In fact, at Heathrow, we have shut our sites, but we're going back to work on Monday. So that is the first day we'll be back to sort of normal construction at Heathrow. Will be this coming Monday. So we're literally checking the sites as we speak at the moment. Then there's reset. So how do we then reset? Is there enough pipeline so we don't lose too many people out of construction, those sort of things? And then, interestingly, reinvent. And that's the bit that I'm really interested in, because I do think that what we're going to learn here is that it is better to have less people on site, and it is better to therefore make more things in factories. And Heathrow's expansion was very keen that we should go down this particular route with a totally digital twin first, and then, you know, break the things down into products which can be made in factories, stored off site, and then put together on site with fewer people on site, so that there are better jobs in factories, safer jobs, higher quality jobs, people living near their home, and at the same time doing all that by using less, in fact, carbon as well. It's been raised by both the speakers so far. What we cannot do is go back to sort of, you know, our bad old ways and forget that actually decarbonisation of our industry at the same time as we change is really, really important. So I think there's a massive opportunity here for the construction sector to understand manufacturing better, such that the whole, in fact, ecosystem of construction, manufacturing, and then putting things together on site through digital is the way that we can really get this better, and we'll be ultimately more productive with less people on sites. But that doesn't mean there's less jobs, because there'll be jobs in factories and in places off-site where people will actually, you know, sub-assemble things, rather than have the large numbers on the sites where it'll be difficult to social distance, etc. So there we are. There's a brief bit about Heathrow, and I think it's really important that we do engage in what infrastructure we want going forward. But then there's a massive opportunity now for the construction industry to do this much, much better going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil, for that. Just to let people know that Phil's got a prior appointment, is going to have to leave us around about 12 noon. So if you've got any specific questions for Phil, then make sure you get them into the question box on your screen at the moment, so that we can make sure that you were able to ask him questions before he has to go. I think he raised a couple of really important things there, particularly the attention on sustainability, which Juliet also picked up on when she spoke as well, and that's something that obviously is part and parcel of resilience, not just from an industry point of view, but from a society point of view as well. Our next panelist is Stephen Hale. Stephen is the director of Crofton Consulting, who are a structural, mechanical, electrical and civil engineering company. Stephen is also involved with the Association for Consultancy and Engineering's SME Forum. So given the fact that many of the firms in our industry are involved, our SME firms, I'm sure Stephen will have some very interesting insights in relation to this whole issue around resilience. So Stephen, your turn next.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, in fact, I'm going to pick up on some of what Phil was saying, but with a slightly different slant, actually. As a small business owner, I wanted to focus on the money, so the economic impacts and how do we become more financially resilient. So I'm going to talk about sort of macroeconomic background, why where we've got a 20% drop in GDP. How might we mitigate against that in the future? What does that mean? What do those measures mean for us as the professions? And how might that affect design? How might that affect the way we need to contract? And pose a question about the structure of the industry as I finalise, really. So thinking about the sort of macroeconomic background, some of the best research I can see is from the Institute of New Economic Thinking at Cambridge University, which is been doing some research in conjunction with the Fed. I think I've given you links to that research paper and their webinar series, Andy, which I would encourage anyone to sort of watch. But what they've done is they've modelled 4 scenarios of the pandemic. No lockdown, a structured lockdown where we avoid a second peak, a poor lockdown where we do get second peaks, and then a lockdown where we stay in lockdown until the virus is no longer there because we discover a vaccine. And the results demonstrate that the best worst case is a structured lockdown. In fact, having no lockdown and coming out too early with a second peak is much worse for us. And interestingly, they do predict a 20% drop in GDP. So they seem to be quite close to that. And the background to that is that largely it's because labour intensive industries that are key to the economy have not got access to labour. So they've got no access to produce stuff, which affects us, I think, because we're so labour intensive in construction quite a lot. And that's one of the reasons I think that we have had such an impact in what, particularly on construction sites. So picking up with what Phil was saying about how do we reduce the volume of labour on sites, I do think that off-site is one of the answers. But I do think that off-site's got to become better because a lot of the off-site that I see is really an assembly process with a building site inside a shed and not a factory environment. So we do need more factories like the Lang O'Rourke workshop, sort of off-site precast facility with a lot of automation and proper factory environment. I think we need to avoid pushing off-site as the only solution, and I think we need to be thinking about automated workflows. What I think we ought to be doing is looking at semi-autonomous robotics. Now, you might think that this is far future, but if you look at the work that Trimble in particular are doing with Boston Dynamics and Hilti, we already have available to us today semi-autonomous robotics that will do things such as production control, scanning, quality control, layout work, and also some production assist. I think we ought to make sure that in our drive for off-site, we don't avoid overlooking other technologies that are there and likely to come at us much quicker than we see. The long-term future for that, from what I can see from the information that I've got from Trimble, and I have had a conversation with their head of emerging technology in Israel, that fully autonomous robotics will be with us within the next 10 to 15 years. So we want to make sure, I think, to keep our eye on that particular ball. And then so what does that mean for us as the designer? Particularly in relation to off-site manufacture and robotics, and our view is that the robot and the manufacturing facility certainly needs more information than we perhaps produce for them in a current form, particularly at a component level. There's no point in sending a robot into a construction site without it knowing what particular fixing it's putting in place, where that fixing goes, and perhaps what sequence that goes in. Our models will clearly need to be more data rich than they currently are to include that data down to a component level. But then as a profession, as a firm of consulting engineers, what does that mean for us? Does that mean that we need to produce more information, or do we need to produce less? Do we stop at defining the client brief and then hand it over to somebody else? Or do we continue in a seamless workflow in a more unfragmented way than we currently do to produce more information? Now, I know as a firm, our approach has been that we need to produce more. The way that we've approached our BIM workflow is that we need to be producing fabrication level detailing so that somebody can pick a piece of drawing up and actually install from it. And the way that we've tackled that is by trying to automate all of the things that we do that are non-cognitive. So our BIM workflows include many custom built add-ins that we've got for Revit in particular that automate a lot of the sort of administrative stuff, and we're now beginning to think about automating some of the front end stuff. What does that then mean for the way we contract? And I think there's a strong argument that the structure of our industry will radically change to enable some of these technologies to be embedded. You know, you think about the way we currently contract with an over-reliance of subcontracting, subcontracting, and highly fragmented kind of nature of our work, and the nature of managing that through defining what's required through a contract, managing the contractual relationship, and every failure being a failure of your ability to meet your contractual obligations, without really looking at the production system itself, without looking at the work. Where is the waste? Where is what is it that we need to do to manage the work rather than the contract? And I very much suspect that we need to be looking more along the lines of Project 13, alliancing, and models that allow a much more integrated workflow, so that we don't have duplication of resource. And then finally, more as a question, what does that mean for the long-term future of our industry? My kind of view is, and as I say, I take it as a view, I'm sure there will be many others, is that in order to be able to capture this change that we will certainly need to be more resilient in the future, the shape of the industry will need to radically change, and I hope that we capture some of that in the work that CLC is doing. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Stephen. And particularly interesting zoning in on the future shape of the industry, really, because shameless plug alert, next week we've actually got a webinar on changing business models in the industry. So it's almost like we planned that. We didn't. So thanks to Stephen for mentioning that. Our final panelist, before we dive into the discussion, and keep those questions coming, we've got quite a lot coming through and they're all lining up some really interesting stuff in there, is Matthew Riley. Matthew is the Managing Director of Ramboll UK. Ramboll are one of the largest and one of the most influential, I think I would say, consultancy firms operating in the UK at the present time, and obviously they operate all over the place. Matthew is an interesting character. I think he would agree with that anyway. But he's actually worked in a number of different parts of our industry. He's worked contractor side, and he's also worked with clients. So I think that kind of makes him an ideal panelist for today's event. But I've said enough about Matthew. It's time for him to say something for himself. Matthew.
Thanks. I'll be brief, so I'm conscious I want to get some questions to Phil before he goes. So I just want to pick up on that last point that Stephen just made about contracting. You won't be able to see, but the pictures behind me, I'll get the right one. Those two pictures behind me are of Terminal 5. Now, they're there to remind me actually around what industry can achieve when we get it right. And Stephen's point about contracts are normally there to penalise failure, not success. The T5 agreement, for many of its failings in some respects, actually was all about getting people focused on providing the best technical solutions and not protecting commercial positions in the event of failure. And that's a complete paradigm shift. And all the things that we've talked about in terms of resilient industry, resilient infrastructure, it does come back to ultimately how people work and how people work together. And I think a lot of the points I was going to raise wouldn't be covered, but I just want to raise maybe 3 points. And it's around people. So Juliet made this observation. Whether we look internally, so some of the points that Chris has raised, what this crisis has demonstrated is you really find out the true culture of your own organisation, and indeed that of your business partners and wider industry. From a Ramboll perspective, look, I've been really delighted, as I'm sure many have, around how people do respond to crises. In fact, in a bizarre kind of way, people behave better in a crisis actually than maybe business as usual. But of course, when crisis management becomes business as usual, that's then a very different proposition, and that's much, much harder to maintain. So we know the technology's there. Actually, we've, in the way of many others, we use laptops, we've got cloud-based activity, we've got flexible working. But this just reinforces how important that is and the extent to which you can really rely on it. So to mobilise, in my case, 1,400 people at home within 24 hours on laptop, we saw virtually, I won't say no loss of productivity, but it was minimal. So the ability to have a resilient and flexible organisation in the way that Chris articulated for both short-term and, dare I say, medium-term resilience is really important. And actually, this has evidenced it. But it's against the background of your own organisation. So, in Ramble, we have our own, what we call fundamentals and the culture and what we're trying to achieve as an organisation. It's absolutely critical you stay true to that. And again, how you play those values out, responding to both the short-term issues that the crisis present, but protecting your beliefs against the medium term. And again, we've done that, tried to do that, how you communicate that to your people, how we lead the organisation. It's critical because how people behave and how they respond both with each other and with business partners and clients is going to make all these things work that Phil and Juliet, Steve and Chris have spoken about. So I've been really pleased with how our people have reacted and stood up to it. And again, I've seen it elsewhere. So it's really, I think as an industry, our people, we've got some fantastic capability. So then you come back to, so what does that mean when we come together? And again, a couple of short-term examples of what I think's worked really well. I'll use payment. It might sound, dirty word, money, but actually, if you look back to the financial crash, 2008, any recession, most people, the first thing they do is protect cash. It's a normal reaction, but actually our industry, and this goes right up to clients like Phil, but not just that, every member of the supply chain. We work with end user clients, we work with other consultancies, we work with contractors, we even work with manufacturers. So wherever you sit in the supply chain, money's flowed. Our payment record is the best it's ever been, and I know I speak for many other consultants who are in a similar position. That actually is the function of two things. Yes, a bit of internal due diligence around how we manage cash, but fundamentally, the industry's recognised its need for money to flow to keep us going, and actually is part of that resilient process. So that's taken leadership, it's taken responsibility, and to some degree, it's taken a lot of trust. So those contractual issues that Stephen's highlighted in business as usual or a pre-COVID market, if I call it that, I won't say they've been put to one side, but actually people have taken a far more pragmatic view, and actually money's flowing. And those kind of those are behaviours. That actually reflects how we work together. So the collaboration that's brought about, I think, has been a brilliant example of what can be done when we need to. So therefore, why can't we protect that going forward as an example of new business as usual? Phil's mentioned Construction Leadership Council. I think it's the first time I've seen in sort of nearly 20 years of being involved in this industry that we've started to come together as a more unified voice. We're quite fragmented with various associations, trade or professional bodies, whatever it might be. But the CRC has done a great job, I think, in bringing us together and corralling us in how we present a unified voice, not both in terms of what we say to government, but as importantly, the solutions we're providing. So the recovery plan, which you've probably started to read about, is a great example of the industry coming together saying, look, government, if you can do these things, reinforce these things, we can respond. Whether it's with the site operating procedures, whether it's through some of the short-term safety issues, but more importantly, the medium-term protecting jobs and actually innovating. And that's so we've got two examples there of actually how we can come together when we're forced to. And informally, I know that Chris, Stephen, myself, and others do AC networks. We speak together informally far more perhaps than we might otherwise, just sharing knowledge about things that are working, maybe things that aren't working quite so well. And all of that collaboration has been fantastic because it gives confidence. And in a recession or in a crisis, people need confidence to continue to invest, to continue doing the right things. So just sharing that information, I think, has been really critical. So when you look forward, so some of the things that Juliet started to touch on, myself and I know others are doing the same, when you look at what the industry needs going forward, whether it's around new design standards, whether it's around digital design, off-site, the whole decarbonisation, particularly buildings and transport, we're firmly accelerating our investment and our thought into that process, because whilst we won't have all the answers, if we do our bit and we work with Stephen and Chris and Phil and others who are doing other bits, it's how you bring all that together in an aggregated way and in a new way of working. And I agree with what Stephen said. The challenge will be, how do you actually collaborate more formally? So we've proved we can do it informally over the last 3 months. How do you take that to another level in whatever form to produce outcomes and get paid for value that we create, produce those societal incomes now about how people want to use their homes, their transport choices, what they want from their towns and cities. As engineers, as consultants, designers, architects, we have the ability as an industry to shape all of that. We have the, people have the knowledge. We just need to create the right environment for that knowledge to be shared and impact. So I'm convinced we've got the solutions. We just need to demonstrate to others, whether it's government or private investors and private clients, that we give them confidence to invest in our knowledge and capability. And that's what I want to see going forward. And I think it's how we get there and how quickly we get there. I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of Phil's time.
Okay, thanks, Matthew, and thanks, for those comments. I think we're going to come back on some of them, I'm sure, in the discussion. Conscious, that Phil's got to leave us at 12, so we're just going to dive into the questions actually, and unsurprisingly, there's a couple being lined up for Phil. Firstly, the question of working off-site and different ways of working have been raised, and later site assembly. Rodrigo Aguinaga asks, this implies a change of design, probably including new and different materials. And on this whole issue of working off-site, have you started doing this on Heathrow projects, Phil?
Thanks for the question. Well, I mean, an excellent question. So we absolutely are doing stuff off-site. The question was about change materials, and I think that for us is the next stage. So I completely agree with what Stephen said earlier. At the moment, quite a lot of what goes on off-site is actually in a factory, in a yard. We do things we would have done on a construction site. And this is the whole manufacturing and construction thing coming together. The ecosystem's got to work. So rather than construction just ordering stuff and expecting it to appear as it's always done, we've got to understand what products we need as we build in the future. Those products then need to be able to be made in factories. So that will lead, you're absolutely right, Rodrigo, to different materials, less materials, etc. All we'll do is just reinterpret what we've done in the past. And I think at the moment, it's lots of people who buy things for contractors know what they want, but they don't know how they get it. But they know they can just order it at the moment. What they've got to learn more about is how you get it and go into that whole cycle of how things are made. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think with materials, and yeah, there are big questions about how we reduce carbon in materials. So one thing we can do is just use a lot less steel and a lot less concrete and cement, which would be great, or find ways of not having not actually using carbon as we make those things. And so therefore I think that questions design standards. It questions going back to are we actually designing from the bottom up, and we can do that now with the tools we've got. As Matthew was saying, we've got the knowledge to actually solve some of these things, but we tend to just go back to what we've done before because we know it works. And I think there's a huge opportunity here to start thinking about things from first principles again, back to the universities, and use all this fantastic kit that has been bought to ensure that we do start using different. So I think your question is a great one, Rodrigo. I think it's the next stage. I think, and that's absolute stage we've got to go to. Otherwise, we won't meet all the targets that we're setting ourselves.
Thanks for that, Phil. And another quick one for you before you have to shoot off, yeah. And that is, you mentioned the question of digital in the construction process. Sometimes what's raised as a barrier for the adoption of that, particularly around BIMs, sometimes seems to be the additional cost or making the business case for using digital. How are you using that in your area, and how are you overcoming some of the challenges? And that's a question from Mark Jenkinson.
Yeah, great. So and another great question. So we believe that we, as the client and the people who own the infrastructure, have got to get more engaged in how the digital works, and not see it as a sort of something that comes as an add-on with a contractor or a consultant or whatever. Obviously, we need the skills from the contractors and consultants to do it, but we feel we should own our data. So we are busy creating our own common data environment, so Heathrow will own the data, and therefore then all the consultants, designers, contractors will come and play with our data and add to it. And then it's a matter of making sure data, can be shared and can be used. So I think, and ultimately, some people do look at it at the moment as a cost. It isn't going to be a cost. It's purely an investment to save lots and lots and lots in the future. But there is potentially a small investment at the front end as we buy more kit, etc. and we invest in people as well who can use the kit and understand digital. We need many more people in our industry who are, digitally enabled, who've got digital in their job titles, all these sorts of things, and so that they believe their job is digital rather than it's digital is a sort of thing on the side in a dusty cupboard with some very clever people working on it. It's got to run through the whole industry. I also believe that at the top of organizations, we need to have people who have accountability for digital. And it's really important, otherwise it will be seen as something that is just an add-on. So I think it's massive, it will be central, and it just is taking its time to get over, such that everyone realizes how key it is. I think with that, Andy, I will probably leave you at this stage, otherwise I'm going to confuse you. So thank you all very, very much indeed. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and hope the rest of the webinar goes well.
Thanks very much for that, for that, Phil. And good luck in the rest of the year. And obviously, as you emerge and as the whole industry emerges from this current situation. But thanks very much for your time today. We had in his introduction, Stephen Hale mentioned this question of business models, and we've got a question from Ian Parker who asks, and this is a question I think to all the panel. I'm going to pose it to Matthew Riley first. Does organisation resilience post-COVID mean a change in business models in order to ensure businesses can survive in a post-COVID environment? So Matthew, any thoughts on that, this whole area of business models? Does it mean a change in the way the industry does business?
Well, the industry, yes. I think how do we survive? It's an interesting word, actually, survive. It's how we transition. So if you're really simplistic about it, we get paid, we pay out, as consultants, we pay out salaries on a monthly basis, and therefore the cash flow we get in has to recognise that outflow. So, but if you look at the value we're trying to create and the investment that goes into some of that value, let's just stick with maybe the automation example that Stephen raised. I know, because when I'm doing it, the way I invest in automation is, or able to at the moment until business models change, is I actually take a slice of my profits and reinvest it, because actually the individual tasks that we've already automated are massively profitable, but they're a small part of the business. So how do you then start to scale that up over new products that Phil started to outline? Now I can do that bit in isolation, and Stephen's given examples of how he's starting to do the same kind of thing. But at what point does that come together, and against what systems does that come together, and therefore against what model do you then get paid to do that? Because if we continue to sort of commoditize that knowledge or automate that knowledge, nobody's going to be able to have the headroom to reinvest and take that further and further and further to create the ultimate value that clients like Phil and others should get out of all of this. So how we make that transition is not easy. I think what I would, I think how we as consultants work with clients, I think is really important. I think the current contracting model for those, when you get involved at that stage, inhibits that process. So we need to change that. And again, you've heard examples of maybe how people go to subcontractors in a fairly traditional sense, because that's what they know and it works, and therefore they see it as risk-free in inverted commas. The irony is, if I just stick with the digital, that actually helps de-risk construction as well, because when you go right into the prefabrication detail that Stephen outlined, is absolutely right. You go straight to the factory. I mean, it is literally, we out the automation we do on things like motorway gantries, go straight to the steel fabricator. And it's, we've designed it in such a way and automated that it also we know how it's going to be assembled out on site. So that level of knowledge and understanding adds real value to the end client. So it's how then do you continue to scale that up, other than the incremental way I'm doing it, because that's just the constraint of my business, the way I'm currently getting paid. If I'm getting paid with some degree of how I can release value, I can accelerate that investment massively and do it with others as well, because I'm not precious about doing it myself. So I guess it does come back to how we engage with clients as a starting point. And we're not talking about massive investments here, relative to what gets spent on, say, ultimately a project. So whether it's a terminal building or a road or a railway, you think of how much that costs, and then the percentage of fees that get spent with consultants as part of that process. This is not a big investment in terms of transition, but the value that can be unlocked is huge.
Chris Young, have you got any thoughts on that? This whole question of business models going forward, are we going to see firms doing things differently as a result of this?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Matthew said there. Actually, I mean, I would hope so. Is the answer to that? It's interesting actually how the question of business models is not a new one. You know, we've been talking about changing business models for probably all of my career, and you know, probably longer than that beforehand. It always strikes me actually, it's quite interesting how you know, we work with certain clients, and they over the last 20 years or so, a number of them have gone through cycles of things like having all of their projects D&B tendered and you know, competitively tendered. Then they move into a cycle of frameworks and alliances and that kind of thing. And then quite often those frameworks and alliances have sort of fallen by the wayside, usually due to a little bit of perceived lack of trust. You know, the client thinks that the consultant and contractor are ripping them off, or vice versa. And then you go back to the D&B model. So these things have tended to go in cycles, in my experience. Now, I've worked in most of those sort of different environments, and actually my view, looking at it from the sort of slightly outside view from the clients, is that the more collaborative those models are, so the closer you get to the alliancing and the partnering type things, the better they work, the more value they produce. They don't necessarily produce the cheapest product, but they produce more value in my experience. And I think the way that we as consultants work with our clients is very important, and convincing the clients actually that, you know, and they know it as well, actually, they do know these things, but continually having that message that actually what you're buying is value, not cost. That's the very important part of it, I think, because it's and especially actually when you get into times, you know, like post financial crisis, post COVID, those kind of things, there will be a temptation to look at costs again. And actually, you've got to keep the conversation on the value and keep the conversation on what's the best thing to do. Again, going back to what I said earlier on, keep that conversation about what's best long-term in resilience, what's the right thing to invest in, and not just focus on the costs. So I think, you know, all of the stuff around Project 13 and those kind of alliance type models, if you look at it sort of slightly dispassionately, it's fairly obvious that those are the right ways to go, but it's just a matter of making sure that everybody is going along with that. And Project 13 is not the panacea for everything. You know, there will be some things that work and some things that don't, but those and it's, when it comes down to it, it's all about the relationships, it's all about the people, and those sort of long-term partnering arrangements and alliances that I've worked in the past, they start off with a contract and a partnering arrangement, but actually the things that make them work are the relationships with the people you develop within those partnering arrangements. So that's what you have to focus on, and try and drive that forward into again, the value concept, and not the cost and the pounds and the hours you spend on it.
Got a question here from Melanie Manton from Sequel. Obviously, the current crisis has created all sorts of questions, and in some ways a crisis of confidence in a lot of different aspects of our lives. Melanie asks, how do you create trust again in infrastructure recovery, from the physical angle, financial, you know, societal needs being safeguarded, the digital aspects, you know, keeping information secure? How do we actually create that trust in the sector again going forward as we come out of this and face up to, you know, potentially future challenges? And I'll pose that question first of all to Juliet. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that. You know, in the round, how do we you know, create that, you know, certainty, trust in infrastructure again? I think Juliet's muted at the moment, so she just needs to unmute herself. Juliet, are you still muted? Just check that. For some reason we can't hear Juliet, so I don't know whether anybody else has got you know, any comment on that. Just butt in, Juliet, if you come back on
So the question was how we create trust.
Yeah.
The balance between predictability and trust, because predictability actually implies a safe, secure, you know, politicians we know love predictability, but that doesn't actually necessarily encourage innovation. So there's a balance in doing that, but ultimately how you create trust is providing, I think confidence is a better word than maybe predictability, that says whether it's in the value we create or the issue that Juliet raised around decarbonisation. You know, showing we've got solutions to these complex problems is the first thing. You know, people sitting here, whether it's a politician saying whether we're going to decarbonise by 2050 or before then, we've got the answers to most of those questions about how we do it. I mean, I know Phil at Heathrow has just done a piece of work that actually shows they can take over 30% out of their construction carbon, and they've got a solution for being carbon neutral in the operation. Now, obviously, there's the aeroplane dimension to the zero carbon Heathrow Airport, but the bits they can control, they're already driving those kind of solutions. Again, you give confidence, that builds trust. So I think as consulting engineers, designers, architects, etc., we've got a lot of the answers, or we'll create a lot of the answers, as long as we've got some headroom to innovate and, dare I say, experiment. So experiment then doesn't necessarily always mean you're going to succeed first time. So this fear of failure, which is terrible in a political environment, actually even in a contractual environment, because Stephen's example earlier, contracts are all about fear of failure or designing for failure, not actually rewarding success. So it's we've got to change that paradigm, create headroom to experiment and innovate, because we can innovate. We've demonstrated that already even in the last 3 months of the stories you read around providing solutions, and that's the frustration. So we create confidence in the solutions, we'll build trust. We've got to get some early wins out of there, though, I must admit.
Juliet, thoughts? I think you're back with us again now. So your thoughts on that question? No, I think you're still muted for some reason. We've got a problem with your microphone, which is not working to the extent that it should be. If you maybe want to log out and come back in again, I don't know if that's possible, or Chetna can speak to you in the background. I think she might well have just come back on board. Juliet? No, we've lost Juliet temporarily.
Andy,
so I'm going to move on.
Andy, could I just quickly pick up on that point of trust, actually?
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on something that Juliet said earlier on, actually, in that the question was, how do we create how do we get the trust back again? I genuinely think, actually, that the trust in the infrastructure industry is not lost already. I think the trust is there. What I think is potentially missing, I think, as Julia said, the infrastructure industry has actually, infrastructure that we've got has coped remarkably well with what we're trying to do. That potentially where the trust is missing, actually, is around certainty and confidence in cost and things like that. There's been a huge debate about the cost of HS2, and actually the number has continually changed. So I think possibly there's one area of trust that does need to be built on, and that's just about a little bit more open and honesty about what it's going to cost, but also about what value you gain from it again.
Okay, thanks for that. I think Juliet has actually joined us now via a different route. This whole question of trust in infrastructure, whether we've lost it or whether we need to build it up again, post-COVID. Any reflections on that, Juliet?
I'm going to try one more time. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Hooray!
So use a headset, by the way.
my trust in my technology would just drop somewhat. I don't know what happened there. So I think the question was pretty much covered, and it's an excellent question. The only other thing I was going to pick up on is coming back to leadership and communication. So from where I'm sitting in the big organization, and I guess everywhere, there's been very poor leadership and poor communications in response to this crisis, and there's been really good ones, and it's something that we've seen previously. And when members of the public are communicated with and understand, the example of the stresses on our infrastructure systems, for example, the power supply, demand has changed, and that does create significant stresses, and it's been a hugely difficult situation. And I think it's just really important to share that with people. And I think if there is no communication, then people don't realize about stresses building, and then something goes and everybody reacts badly to it. So I think that's a really important lesson. Strong communication from our leaders is key.
Stephen Hale, your views on this too?
Just a quick one. Yeah, the one thing that I've been really pleased to see, particularly the work of the CLC, but the communication that we've had at the SME group at the ACE, because if you sort of think about trust in our infrastructure in its sort of big sense, a lot of that revolves around their local infrastructure and their local, what happens to them locally. And there's been an interesting, and everybody that's raised this at the SME group has said that a lot of new investment or work to make us more resilient needs to be at a local level. And it's interesting to see that that's reflected in the CLC's output with, so I think we get trust back by making people's lives better at a local level. And I think it's really pleasing to see that the CLC have picked up on that and have a working party looking at it. So I'm relatively confident that they're sort of on the right track with it.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got quite an interesting question here, and I think this speaks to the role of firms and the role of the industry going forward, because we spoke about infrastructure, we spoke about firms, but obviously this whole city agenda and let's talk about cities. How do cities struggling around the world become more resilient, dealing with the current crisis as well as long-term social disruption, not to mention economic? We've all seen the stuff on the news about how, as we come out of this crisis, there are still going to be restrictions in place and all the rest of it. And I read a couple of reports recently about how a number of leading construction firms are working with city authorities to actually help them become more resilient. So how can the industry assist in that process, and what are the big issues maybe that city authorities are actually looking at from the point of view of resilience going forward? And I'm going to pose that one in the first instance back to Juliet. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, again, one of the things that COVID has helped to emphasize is how critical our infrastructure systems that we all work on are. I think that's really important. We sort of use the phrase the missing middle, that people don't quite understand what they're relying on. But I think the more we're all at home seeing the importance of supply chains, of power, of information infrastructure, it shows the importance. But in terms, so cities are a lens where all our infrastructure systems come together, all of them become fundamentally important. But I'm really interested, and I don't know the answer, is we've talked for many years about the trend towards urbanization, and the 70% of the global population living in cities by 2050, or I think that's a similar number. But there's changes now, and again, is it a short-term change? There was something in the papers this morning about people looking to move out of cities, much more people wanting to live in the suburbs. The importance of a garden right now is huge. So there's been this big drive towards densification for resilience and efficiency, and having our communities sort of living and working together. And we don't know yet whether that's a short-term change or a sort of long-term significant change. But again, it just picks up on the uncertainty. So how we can help working with our city leaders is, it is complex, it is uncertain. We're always trying to sort of make the best strategic decisions, balancing a number of different issues.
Chris, any views on that? How the industry can actually be working with city authorities and other authorities? I mean, clearly they're going to need help going forward. Are we getting in there? Are we advising them in the way that we need to?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's clearly some sort of fairly specific practical things that are likely to come out of this. The whole issue of working from home, of being more flexible about our hours that we work and things like that. I mean, we've been looking at scenario planning of getting people back into some of our city centre offices, and one of the things that straight away comes up is, okay, well, why do we all have to start at 9 o'clock in the morning? And that's a fairly simple, practical thing to do. But spreading out the use of our sort of precious resources and our infrastructure is one of the things that I think will probably have to happen. Working hours and patterns will change to reduce that kind of morning and evening rush on our infrastructure. And similarly, lunchtimes where everyone dashes out and uses the underground again, or uses the services to get their lunch and things like that. So those sort of simple spreading things out, I think might happen to a degree. But I think the overall situation with people wanting to live in cities will still continue. I don't see any huge change to that. So we will have to design better systems to be able to manage those large groups of people. It's interesting, actually. I mean, I don't know the answers again, but I wonder what the significant differences are between, we talk about cities in large developed countries, and that's a very, very different proposition to cities in underdeveloped countries, and how they are going to cope and survive is quite an interesting question as well, and particularly around the whole decarbonisation and environmental issues. We're very focused on these things, but there's a vast number of people live in cities that are nowhere near as advanced, nowhere near as far down those conversations, but probably have a much bigger, much more significant impact on that as well. So that's quite I don't know the answers, but it'll be interesting to see how they develop.
Chris, you may raise it. I'm going to bring you in. Go on, come in now, Matthew.
I was going to make a point. One of the quick ways to do that is to learn from others who are doing it. So, and this isn't a shameless plug for my Nordic colleagues by any means, but you look at cities like Copenhagen, Stockholm, Oslo, and there are others outside of the Nordics. They're well ahead of the UK in this space, like miles ahead. I mean, Copenhagen I think in 2009, made a declaration to be carbon neutral city by 2025, and it will now do that. And it's planned all its infrastructure, systematically to achieve that outcome. And as consulting engineers, we've been a key or integral part of that process, whether it's through putting 1 million people on a district heating network, whether it's plugging in, the energy from waste centre that's got the ski centre on top of it, and taking all, reusing the heat back into that system, whether it be the metro systems and the cycle and walkway. Just little anecdotes like, did you know that actually if you increase the size of the pavement for cyclists and pedestrians to use, actually it increases the retail sales. So there are little things there in the detail. If you know these things from a design perspective, you can add value, a more holistic value to whatever it is that they're trying to create in the towns and cities. So yes, we're going to see patterns change around people, the whole densification debate. But in levels of detail, learn from those cities that are ahead of the UK, and a number of the UK cities are already making their own declarations about being carbon neutral. So I think the answer to your question is yes, there's more we need to do. And I think, as I say, perhaps as consulting engineers, architects, designers, we're not as good at maybe selling ourselves around in terms of what we can do and the benefits we can provide. But if we learn from others, then there's a huge opportunity to do more in that space.
I think just a couple of quick things before I move on to what I think will be the penultimate question. There are obviously quite a lot of different networks of cities that I think we should be intervening in more as an industry. Some of them have been mentioned in the questions in the chat. The Global Resilient Cities Network. You've obviously got Future Cities, UNDP, C40, all sorts of different organisations that maybe we should be actually making a move on, and it's certainly something that we're interested in here at Infrastructure Intelligence. I think there was a very important point raised, and unfortunately we haven't got time to go into it in this particular event, by Chris Young, when he mentioned about some of the developing world, where some of the issues around all of this are on a completely different level. And I think it's often forgotten about the position that they're in, and I think we need to think about that as well. Another question, and this is kind of about the kind of infrastructure we're going to have going forward, and resilience is part of that. A shift to how our infrastructure projects produce society benefits seems now to be a requirement, particularly at a time when there might be limited capital available. Do the panel think that investors will start to require this? And what are some of the frameworks and tools that you're using to integrate and measure this? So this whole question of societal benefit going forward, which is probably going to become even more important to the infrastructure that we actually develop. I'll ask that question first of all to Stephen Hale, and then Juliet after him. So Stephen, your thoughts on this whole question of demonstrating value. How do we actually do that going forward? Are we going to be doing more of it?
If I'm honest, I'm not particularly sure that investors will want to value social benefit. They might have it as a KPI, but an investor's just going to want to make his money. I think that's going to have to be driven by government. And I think what we might find and what we might see is that schemes that are unviable at the moment because there's some early stage risk that's necessary that the investors just don't have the appetite for, that needs to be overcome. We might need to see some sort of small amount of government intervention there, be that by grants or government-backed loans, that then frees up the larger capital once the risk part of that project has been sort of de-risked. And you can imagine schemes where there's a significant sort of risk around planning or other environmental issues, but once that's out of the way, there's private capital available to be invested. I'm not entirely sure, whilst the money might talk about social values, they still want to make money. I think there's a role for the state in there rather than just private capital to enable the private capital to be invested and make money at a later date. Yeah.
Julia, your thoughts on that, maybe as well from a resilience point of view. Is value important? Will it become more important going forward?
I think one answer is it has to. We've talked about this a lot, but we all do genuinely have to transform to building the right long-term solutions, not just the short-term solutions. I agree with Stephen that that's not the universal sort of approach of investors, but I think as well as there being a role for government, there's a role for us to convince them about the long-term value. Certainly, decarbonisation now is, things like the task force for climate disclosure. That is coming right to the top of investors' priorities. Because they can see that they're going to have stranded assets otherwise. So suddenly the value is clear, but I think there is a bigger case. There is a case that brings in social value, brings in the sort of environmental benefits, the health and well-being and benefits of the right solution. And part of that is for government, but I think part of that is also down to us to start presenting that holistic business case and emphasize the wider benefits.
Matthew, do you have any thoughts on this question around value?
Well, I think in this way that investors are almost now using the Sustainable Development Goals and other measures that Juliet's outlined as almost a hurdle now. So in other words, any investment they make in the wider social or economic infrastructure has got to demonstrate that we are decarbonising or we're reducing our environmental footprint on the built environment. So the social value, I think, will be the next hurdle. So, because if you think where this money comes from, it's our pension funds. It's our, that's ultimate. So people are far more knowledgeable now about where their money goes than they used to be 10, 20 years ago. And I do think a lot of these financial institutions are very aware that where they get their money from, people want to know that their money is being invested in the right way. So yes, it will take a bit longer, I think, to maybe get the social value dimension into that hurdle. But I don't think it'll be too far. I think it'll happen within 5 years, because I did say that the whole sustainable agenda now with finance, it's a hurdle now. It's built into their model, and they won't invest without it for the reason that Juliet's just outlined. They don't want to be left with stranded assets. So it's just a question of how quickly that occurs, I think.
Right, I've just got one final question for all of our panelists to sort of wrap things up. We've obviously discussed quite a number of different issues here across the piece, everything from core resilience around infrastructure, around firms, around organisations, the whole issue around business models as well. But I just want to ask this question. Clearly, the last few months really have been a massive learning curve for many organisations. What's the one, if you can alight on one key takeaway, key learning point around the resilience of, and this can be of infrastructure as a whole or of your business itself? What's the key learning point that you've taken from the recent period? And I'll kick off with Stephen Hale first of all. Stephen.
Yeah, I think just looking at our business, which is quite a small business, if I think about it, we've been able to adapt quite quickly to be able to continue to produce work, and that's been great, and people have responded to that. The one thing that started to come out that we need to make sure we focus a lot of our effort on is our staff's mental well-being, to make sure that they continue to be supported there, particularly while they're in isolation, and all of the social networks that are available to them whilst they're at work continue to be available to them in some form. So I think for us, yeah, it's easy to do the sort of mechanical stuff, get the work done, it's out the door, but looking after people and their mental well-being is the thing that we need to focus on for the longer term.
Thanks, Stephen. Chris Young, thoughts on that? A key sort of takeaway, key learning point?
Yeah, I'll probably sort of do more than one actually, but I mean, I think I very much agree with Stephen actually. The most important thing about the resilience and the ability that we've had to cope at the moment is how our staff have reacted and pitched in. We have all of the systems in place that we have, and we have lots of the IT that's there. Okay, some of our IT is not quite as we wanted it to be, and it'll get there in the end. But actually, the way people have worked together, communicated, we've done staff surveys. Actually, it's quite interesting how some people say they're actually talking to more people than they did before, and have met newer people than they had never met before in our business. So that ability to communicate is incredibly important. But actually, you can't let go of the social aspect and the community that you've developed. There's absolutely no way in this world I would ever want our business to continue with everyone working from home as it is now. And getting people back to offices in some form, probably not full time, but in some form, to reconnect and to strengthen those relationships of the people within our business. That's the fundamental key to the resilience in the longer term, I think, is the people that you have and how they work with each other.
Julia, over to you. A key takeaway around this whole issue before I bring in Matthew at the end.
Thanks, Andy. There's always a bit of pressure to find the absolute words of wisdom for the closing thing. But I think for me, the key thing is focusing on where the opportunity is from where we are now. And a lot of people have talked about the COVID and the lockdown as the reset button. And I think there have been some really positive things from a very personal point of view. Straight after this, I'm going downstairs to have lunch with my whole family. That never happened, and that's really important. So keep the things that have worked, not to go back to, as someone else already said, not go back to the bad old ways, but also there's even more opportunity to transform. So there's lots of things haven't been great at all. So how do we consciously steer working with our clients to the right outcome, keeps the good stuff, but also moves us towards an even better place. And I think there is genuinely, this is, it's almost now or never. This is a great time to be thinking in that way.
You're on mute, Andy. You're asking me to speak. All right.
Yes, sorry, Matthew. Yes, well lip read, that man. Your thoughts.
Right. Well, a lot of it's been said, but it is maybe not surprising that it takes a crisis to accelerate all the good things about our culture, how we collaborate and how we innovate, because we've got examples and given examples of that. I wouldn't advocate creating a crisis every year, because it has its pains and its management stresses, but fundamentally, yeah, it's how do you harness that? Because what we've proved is we can do it. Actually, we probably always knew we could do it, but the pace of change we've often probably thought of in financial plan or sort of strategic planning cycles of 3, 4 or 5 years. Actually, we've probably achieved more in the last 3 months, and I know I have, of things I was planning to take 18 months to do. So actually, we accommodate that in a very positive way. That's not a negative statement. So whether it's how we communicate with each other has been a real positive. We certainly plowed a lot of effort into well-being, but actually that's people supporting each other in a different way. And also how we innovate and work with clients, how we provide design solutions, all those things under that banner of the crisis has forced us to accelerate our thinking and our focus into those areas, and therefore it begs the question, why isn't that sort of business as usual? So
thanks for that, Matthew, and thanks to our excellent panel, to Phil, who had to leave for something else earlier, from Heathrow, to Stephen Hale from Crofton Consulting, to Chris Young from Tony G, Juliet Meehan from the Resilient Shift, and obviously Matthew himself from Ramboll UK. That's just about it for today's webinar. I think it was interesting that all of the speakers, in answering that last question, talked about the role of people, which I think is absolutely crucial, as we know, in our industry, and something we will obviously never forget, because without the people who make up the industry, we don't have an industry. A quick, and this is a shameless plug, for our next webinar next week, which is on the question of business models, which got raised a couple of times in the discussion. 11 o'clock next Friday. Another great panel with some really big firms from the industry, good knowledge from the Construction Innovation Hub and the Construction Leadership Council in next week's webinar. And then just give an advance plug for our webinar on the 26th of June, which is actually going to be quite, I was going to nearly said a practical session. It's going to be a session on communications in the new digital landscape. And we've got a couple of experts, well, a number of experts who are speaking at that event, who are actually going to show us how to webinar better and Zoom better and Teams better. Apparently there's a science to it. I don't understand it myself, but apparently there's ways that you can look better that doesn't involve plastic surgery, which is always a good move in my back. So big thank you to everyone who's logged in today. Massive thanks to all of our panelists, and hopefully we'll see some of you again next week for the latest II seminar webinar on business models. So thanks very much, and hope you have a great day and a fantastic weekend. So tatty bye to everybody.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Thanks.